We are a young company with a long history. Today, we are 66,000 employees in over 70 countries with different backgrounds, experiences, expertise, and individual qualities. We share a vision for shaping the future of healthcare, a future without fear of cancer, a future where people lead healthier and longer lives. Join us in shaping the future of healthcare.
Hello and welcome. I'm Malika Kapoor, Deputy Global Editor of Bloomberg Live and your host for Bloomberg Prognosis, Reshaping Cancer Care. Cancer remains a leading cause of death worldwide. Nearly 10 million people died from it in 2020. And even as the medical community makes outstanding progress in cancer research, the stark reality is that many patients lack access to affordable, high-quality care. Here at Bloomberg Prognosis, Reshaping Cancer Care, we bring together leading health industry executives from around the world for in-depth conversations on how to revamp and democratize cancer care. But before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge our sponsor, Siemens Healthineers. And remember, if you experience any issues with audio or video quality, try to refresh your browser, or you can use the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen for support. Social media, we are active on it. It's hashtag Bloomberg Prognosis. Use it to engage with us, and you can also engage with other attendees by using the event chat in the bottom right corner of your screen. With that, let's get started, and it's over to my colleague Drew Armstrong for the first session.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to our Bloomberg Prognosis event on the equality issues in cancer care. I'm Drew Armstrong. I'm Bloomberg's senior editor for healthcare, and we're going to be talking about an issue that has been heightened, even if it already did exist, by the COVID-19 pandemic, one that has filled hospitals with patients, but also cut off many people from access to care for other diseases. I'm joined today by Susanne Schaffert, president of Novartis Oncology, one of the world's biggest pharmaceutical researchers and manufacturers, and by Bernd Montag, the CEO of Siemens Healthineers, which makes equipment used in hospitals around the world for imaging, diagnostics, and therapy. I should also mention that Siemens Healthineers is a sponsor of today's event, but let's go ahead and jump right in. I want to talk first and ask both of you to answer this question just about how the pandemic has reshaped or impacted cancer care. We hear a lot about patients who haven't been able to get in for screening or for therapy. Where are we going to see that both in the short-term effects that I think we've heard a lot about, but what are going to be the longer-term impacts of that? How is that going to play out over the next several years? Bernd, I'll go to you first, and then Susanna, we can kick you off after that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we track that very closely by looking how our machines are used both in the imaging side and on the diagnostic side. And there was a clear period, where checkup procedures, screening, but even semi-urgent care was not delivered, simply because either hospitals had other priorities, needed to have other priorities, or because patients were concerned to go to the hospitals. So there is certainly an effect, a significant effect of delayed care, and which means that certain cancers will have been caught later than normal, which certainly will have a negative impact.
Are you all able to see that then in the usage statistics for your machines that are in hospitals? You were able to actually plot the kind of the decline in usage stats over time, or the type of usage that was being done?
I mean, what we can do, I mean, we are very, of course, operating within the limits we have in sniffing what our customers are doing. But when we look at usage data, we have definitely seen usage going down, especially during the first wave, while it's now coming, has since about 9 months come back to more or less normal levels. But that delay of screening exams and also elective procedures, especially around the first wave, has been very pronounced.
Susanne, are you all seeing similar things? And I'm wondering if that affects the type of people or the characteristics of folks who are able to make it into care, because I think we all know that a lot of times, people who have more resources are more able to navigate these types of obstacles in certain cases. I'm wondering what you all have seen I know every pharma company out there closely tracks pharmaceutical prescribing data. Talk to me about what you all are seeing broadly in this area.
Yeah, I mean, during the pandemic, our focus was really on supplying and supporting patients already on treatment. And I believe that has worked very well. There was a lot of strategies around how we can make sure patients receive their therapies, how we ship things, home delivery, home nursing systems. So that was quite great. I mean, as Bernd laid out, diagnostics and screening was really missed. And there's millions of people that did not get their screenings. Like in Europe, we know there's around 1 million patients that are not diagnosed, that probably carrying around cancer disease. And what this means, and that's for me really the call to action, is that there is calculation that say the progress we have made on cancer care has been put back by a decade with the pandemic. And you know how hard we work to improve outcomes and improve survival rates for cancer. That's at the end what matters. And we know that all the misses that we had during the pandemic is putting this back 10 years or more. So it requires that we find new strategies to keep on fighting against this deadly disease and give more people life.
Were there certain healthcare systems or places in the world that you all saw able to navigate this more effectively? I'm thinking, again, back to what I mentioned, these impacts don't always get felt the same way. I live in a, relatively wealthy area with good broadband. I was actually able to see and get a medical condition diagnosed online via video visit for my personal care physician. Not everybody has that. And I know, oncology, the stakes are certainly a lot higher. Did you all see differing impacts of those types of things around the globe?
I mean, definitely, yes. Certainly the adoption rate of telemedicine and digital tools comes at different speeds. Yeah? So I think here, to maybe focus on the US, we saw a quicker uptick. On the other hand, as a downside, when looking at the US, the topic of hospitals depending so much on elective procedures and then even closing down operations because of the lack of cash flow, so to say, is a downside. Yeah. So where we saw, for example, in the European, but also in the Asian systems, which are a little bit more publicly organized, or organized by the public, we saw a higher stability of the overall system.
And Susanne, what about you all?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Drew.
No, go ahead. I was hoping you would chime in there, actually.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, what we see from our side, that you saw this inequality certainly between countries, and unfortunately low and low income countries were really impacted most. But as Bernd said, even within a country like the US, you saw these inequalities. You saw the outcome of COVID was different, but it's the same in cancer, that certain populations really were disadvantaged, and that's something we really have to address.
Bernd, you mentioned the telemedicine uptake rate, and I wanted to ask you about that. What changes in care delivery that we've seen over the last 18 months do you all believe are permanent and sticky and will stay around? Because I mentioned, my personal visit to a physician, I had to go to a cardiologist to go get my cholesterol reviewed. And this was maybe a month ago after our hospitals were reopened and things had calmed down. One of the things they said is, we're doing all visits like this in person now. And so, medical professionals we know see kind of a return to habit. I'm sure that there are billing incentives to get them back to do that. What are these changes through the pandemic that, in I think some cases, made care more accessible for some patients? What do we think remains sticky and remains around? And then a second part of that question, are there particular conditions or something like that this will be stickier for? I certainly feel fine getting a primary care, cholesterol discussion done with my, cardiologist over video. if I had just been diagnosed with cancer, I would probably feel far different about that. Can you all walk me through what you believe stays out of the changes we've seen, and what truly is a more structural shift?
I'm thinking about what number to give here when I echo what Susanne said about what is a step maybe backwards in cancer care. I think there's a leap forward when it comes to the adoption of digital tools and telemedicine. So, and I was thinking, should I say 5 years or 10 years? Yeah, when it comes to the adoption and the willingness to accept, hey, this reversal of the default, which we saw during the pandemic, yeah, that the on-site is not what you want, but you try to do as much without physically meeting, has proven a lot, yeah, into many that it is possible. And I think that is, on the one hand, for the more simple cases, as you refer to, but on the other hand, also in cancer, where let's say I sometimes call it hunting for the second or third opinion, yeah, is still there, yeah, and will stay for a while. These are also things which can be done remotely, because in the end it's about getting access to the physician with all the data basically already there, and it's just that second or third look on the same situation. Yeah, so I believe it has brought us an acceleration of these different way of distributing knowledge, yeah, between caregivers, but also between patient and caregivers by 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and maybe what I believe is telehealth and having these engagements between a treating physician and a patient virtually, this will stay and will also take a huge burden from patients. I mean, not everybody is aware that patients that are treated in centers, and this is really the majority of cancer patients, they have to travel for every quarterly routine check, 40 to 100 miles. And of course, with telehealth, there is the possibility that they can stay at home and that they avoid this travel. I mean, there is also a lot of home monitoring possibilities that certainly also Bernd could talk about, that will bring additional convenience to patients, that they avoid all this travel during such a intense treatment. That I believe will stay. And it's then also the education piece. That for me was quite unique about COVID. First of all, that everybody collaborated, that we could break down silos that existed maybe before, and that education information was made available to many and to all stakeholders. And I hope that will help patients to navigate their way easier, as Bernd, as you mentioned, the second opinion, all these kind of things, that we can educate patients on how to navigate, how to find your best center, your best treatment option. That is hopefully something that will stay.
Are you all seeing those kind of shifts, in this most recent phase of, healthcare system openness? Are you all seeing that in the numbers you all see in terms of how patients access care and where that's coming? I mean, what are the trends you're actually seeing on the ground so far in terms of the kind of long-term evolution of those types of remote care and distributed care?
I mean, in healthcare, it's always an ecosystem of many players here, because it's the patient, it's the provider, it's the payer, and typically when you change practice, it requires openness of the patient. It requires also the willingness of the provider to adopt to change, and it is about the willingness of the payer to also finance it, or to change reimbursement. And this is also what often makes change in healthcare a little bit slower than elsewhere. And what I can observe is really that this openness is much more pronounced, that all three pull in the same direction.
I want to ask you to change gears here a little bit. Neither of you are COVID vaccine manufacturers, obviously, but I think everybody in the healthcare industry watched the development of these vaccines quite closely. And there was a different relationship with government, with the regulatory bodies. I would probably say a different approach to risk-taking in what can often be a very, very expensive development process. So you talk to pharmaceutical CEOs, usually their kind of de-risking process can play out over years and years and years because of the investment that's needed. When you all look at that process and think about your own processes for where you enter new businesses, how you work with governments, and how you pursue research and think about the type of risk you're willing to take under what conditions, how much has the experience of the pandemic and the observations of the pandemic changed the way you approach those things in your businesses and how you think about them and what you're willing to do? Susanne, can we go to you first on that?
Yeah, sure. As you know, the drug development process is a very long one, and it's also hard to find the right cancer drug. Just to give you an idea, only 1 out of 15 cancer assets will finally make it to approval. So therefore, we have to be very bold in how we develop things, and we know that the time is years. What was interesting at COVID is, as you nicely said, Drew, was this willingness to take risks and do things in a completely new, very disruptive way. I mean, just to share a few things that we have done, as we also worked with others on exploring therapies and things like that, for example, trial recruitment suddenly was done digitally. That was a no-go before, and now suddenly it was absolutely appropriate to go out to the social networks and see where are patients and accelerate this. And then even the monitoring, as you know, this is a quite cumbersome and highly regulated process. Monitoring visits were done remotely just to keep trials going. And these kind of things really were, of course, pushed with the willingness to take more risk and speed. What it required is close dialogue with regulators and with healthcare systems in general. That is, for me, the learning that we have to keep on doing, engage early in the dialogue and bring people together before there is a final solution. And hopefully the openness to go disruptive ways will stay.
Bernd, what are your observations on this? How do you think this is going to affect the innovation in the industry over the long term?
Yeah, I think what has definitely changed is that the public and governments look at healthcare differently. Yeah? It's not as a cost factor, but this is a super important part of the economy, but also of the welfare and competitiveness of a nation. Yeah, and it's not like, whoa, here they go again, and this is also expensive and so on. But that this is really at the forefront of innovation, and there is more openness and also more openness for dialogues. And what also helps, I think, is to see. I looked it up today again. I mean, it's very, very sad. Yeah, that. I think up to now 4.6 million people died of COVID worldwide. Yeah, but cancer is 20 million incidents per year. Yeah, so it's always hard to compare the two. Yeah, but that topic to basically address, we are talking about a pandemic, which is always there. Yeah. And looking at what can we learn from COVID to deal with this pandemic we got used to is a different angle of looking at things, which helps us and I think medicine to also question some of the principles of the past.
Bernd, I want to ask you a question that is going to sound like it's a computing and an AI question, but it's actually also an equality question. We've heard for a long time, and I've been covering healthcare for 15 years, and over the last several years, I get constant pitches about imaging AI and deep machine learning to do imaging. And this is something that kind of feels like it's always on the brink of breaking through and helping democratize diagnosis and bring quality diagnosis to more people, because obviously one of the big constraints in healthcare is having, expert technicians and doctors be able to go out there and read scans and do diagnosis and do imaging work to find types of conditions. What is your view? I mean, I'm sure you guys see and look at this technology all the time. I'm sure you get pitched it. I know you all do work here in the machine learning space and quite a bit of it. Where are we on the development of imaging AI and deep learning and being able to truly see a breakthrough here? Is there even going to be a kind of, big breakthrough aha moment where, for many instances, a computer can replace a doctor? Or is this just going to be an era of kind of small incremental improvement and efficiency for years and years and years, and there won't be some big aha moment that we all look up and say, oh my gosh, the world has changed?
I think there will be an oh my gosh, but not in one moment. But when we look back, what has the internet done to us, or what has the iPhone done to us over the years, we will see it in hindsight. And we are a leader when it comes to AI development. A real leader when it comes to the technologies we have, the patents we have. And here it's really about gradually taking over tasks, routine tasks of physicians, of radiologists, so that they can focus on the more difficult topics and can work top of license. And I think what we also should not forget that there's an element of democratizing imaging in AI, because there are still billions of people who live in a world where there is no radiologist, and where technology is a solution to the staff shortage. And here the progress is pretty fast. But I think we should have a bit of a less controversial way of putting it. Well, we are replacing the doctor. We are, on the one hand, bringing the doctor where there is no doctor. And on the other hand, we allow highly qualified radiologists not to spend valuable time with routine tasks.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time. Susanne and Bernd, I want to thank both of you. This has been interesting and fascinating. I wish we had a few more minutes to continue our discussion. Thank you both for being with Bloomberg Prognosis, Siemens Healthineers, and Novartis Oncology. It's been a pleasure to have both of you, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michelle Fay Cortez. I'm the Chief Medical and Science Reporter for Bloomberg News, based in Hong Kong. And we're having a distinguished panel today to discuss about cancer treatment and access. Joining us today, we have Dr. Bhagavia Bakshi, who's the co-founder of See the Signs, which is a support service and tools for doctors to help them quickly diagnose and treat patients with cancer. We have Dr. Sunita Maheshwari, who's the Chief Dreamer of Teleradiology Solutions. And we have Dr. Jaideep Gokte, who's the Global Chief Medical Officer of Cipla, which is a leading pharmaceutical company based in India and making a difference worldwide. Thank you, each one of you, for joining us today. We're going to start off with Dr. Bakshi, wondering if you can give us some insight in terms of where we are when it comes to cancer. Now, obviously, there's about 17 million people who are diagnosed every year with cancer. 10 million die from it. So this is an area where there's a huge amount of need, and obviously, we're certainly not curing everyone of this. So everything from diagnosis to treatment to repeat returning care, I'm wondering if you can tell us where we are in terms of people getting the access that they need.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So globally, cancer is the second leading cause of death. 1 in 6 people get cancer. And as you mentioned, we still have many strides to make in improving cancer outcomes. And one of the biggest challenges is being able to diagnose cancer in the early stages, where we know it has the best chance of survival for the patient, both in terms of primary cancers, but also in terms of recurrences as well with secondary cancers. Right now, we know globally in kind of the Western world, about 50% of patients are diagnosed in the late stages, and in the global South and Southeast Asia, it can be up to 70% of patients are diagnosed in the late stages of disease, which has a significant impact on outcome. And when we look at early recognition and referral in more detail, we see that patients present late to their healthcare professions because the early signs of symptoms of cancer are often vague and non-specific. And equally, healthcare professionals seem to miss the early signs and symptoms of cancer because they mimic more benign and less worrying conditions. So often it's a delay in presentation and often a delay in referral that results in patients being diagnosed in the late stages. And then further down the line, line. When you overcome the access challenge, we need to think about access to diagnostics, access to specialist care as well, once a patient has been identified at risk, and all of that happening in a very timely manner, because we know that an early cancer can become a late stage cancer within just 2 months. So it's one of those things that not only timely detection, but also being able to get people on the right treatment plans in a very quick space of time is critical.
Dr. Maheshwari, I have to say, I love your title, Chief Dreamer. So that's really an interesting title, obviously co-founder, but also wondering if you can come back and explain to us what the Chief Dreamer title is, and also telling us about the availability of the technology that we have in order to actually detect these patients soon. Do we actually have what we need in order to get the kind of early detection in order to make a difference in these lives? Or are we still looking for some kind of really innovative, transformational discoveries in order to make real differences here?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I guess I'm Chief Dreamer, but just dreaming, I've realized, doesn't work. And I've also been asked, is there a hierarchy in dreaming? So I'm thinking of changing my title. But, as a physician, as a doctor, I dream because I feel that we should be able to have solutions for everyone. And I trained at Yale University in the US and then moved to India 20 years ago for that very fact that, what can we do to make sure everyone has access? And that's really the dreaming bit. In terms of what we've achieved, I think in the medical world, technologically, we've come a long way. So if you look at cancer, for instance, just diagnosing it, if you don't diagnose it, you can't even begin to get to Cipla to get your medicine. So the first part is really diagnosis, and one of the challenges that the medical profession, especially in Asia, has been a lack of radiologists. For instance, there are only 10,000 radiologists in India versus 100,000 in the United States. A lack of accredited labs. Like in India, we have about 1,200 accredited labs. In the United States, we have 260,000. When we talk about just having, the ability to diagnose by having manpower and by doing the actual tests. So I think what has changed, for instance, teleradiology, what we do. You can have a radiologist sitting in a big city who can then cover multiple smaller cities and give an expert opinion. So technology has enabled that. I think technology has certainly enabled, for instance, the machines, the mammo machines. It used to be so painful, it's less painful. There's a lot of stuff that's happened with diagnostics. I think artificial intelligence, I see, is going to be the big thing for the next decade, because even radiologists are human and they can miss things. So there's an estimation that, every year 200,000 inaccurate studies are reported by humans. So if we can get in, and for instance, we've developed something called Mammo Assist, which is a breast imaging, auto detection of breast cancer. So if you can do auto detection of early cancers using AI algorithms, and then let the radiologist look at it again to confirm, and then send it on to your oncologist and surgeon, this is going to be a game changer. And I think we're getting there. And there's going to be a lot of progress in this in the next few years.
Dr. Gupte, obviously, when it comes to cancer, everybody wants a magic bullet. They really do want something that they can take, preferably a pill, preferably something that's just once a day or maybe once a week. But the truth of the matter is that a lot of these medicines that we have, don't always work that well, and they do have physical and financial toxicities. I'm wondering if you can talk to us about where we are when it comes to the medicine for cancer. We hear an awful lot about alternatives to chemotherapy, alternatives to some of the surgeries that one needs. Are we making progress when it comes to increasing survival and improving quality of life with the medicines that we have for cancer?
So thanks, Michelle, for having me, and that's a very loaded question. Clearly, we have made significant progress, I think, in the last 10 to 15 years, especially with the advent of what we call targeted therapy. With the help of targeted therapy, we have been able to, and this is based on the fact that we are able to identify proteins which are specifically abnormal in the cancer cells rather than the normal cells, or cells which have certain genetic mutations which happen only in the cancer cells. This has really led to significant advances, but I would say we still don't have a magic bullet like we had what the penicillins did to infections in the 1920s and 30s. And we know even penicillins, after being a magic bullet, have had the big problems of antibiotic resistance. But I think we've made significant progress. We've got to be optimistic. If I, for example, just leave out the large monoclonal antibodies, even small molecules, which are targeted therapies, we have 89 of them that are now approved in the last decade or so. So that's a huge number of new drugs that have come into the market for targeted cancer patients with possibly some reduced side effects. We all thought in the beginning that targeted therapy would really minimize adverse effects, but we now are understanding that that's not really true. Even some of the normal cells do express some of these altered mutations, and they are certainly not the magic bullet that we are looking for. So while we have made significant progress, especially in some cancers, like the hematological malignancies, for example, imatinib was a great example of how chronic myeloid leukemia could be converted into a chronic long-term disease, or the advent of trastuzumab for breast cancer over HER2 positive, which had a roughly 40% positive impact on mortality. We have made some progress, or rituximab, which specifically treated and which is specifically targeted CD20 molecules. So I think we have made very good progress there, and of late immunotherapy, but that has its share of adverse events, although they are lesser, but also brings about significant, what you mentioned, financial toxicities. So I think we are getting there, but at least as far as low and middle income countries go, we have a very, very long way to go.
Yeah, it definitely seems like there's been a lot of progress when it comes to cancer, certainly with the technology and the innovation that we've had in the last 10 or 20 years. It's been really dramatic. We can see just from the survival numbers that things are improving, but also so much further to go. Of course, the last 2 years have had another layer of complexity on top of this because of the coronavirus pandemic. So I'm wondering if we can just talk through this briefly to examine the impact that the coronavirus has had in each one of the areas where you guys are working. I think this panel is really great because you guys do touch on all of the different areas. You touch on the intersection of the doctor and the patient and the actual diagnosis. You touch on the imaging and the technology, and also on the actual access to medication. So I'm wondering if each one of you can talk through how coronavirus has impacted your business and your access to making a difference for patients. So let's start with Dr. Bakshi. What is the situation? How has coronavirus affected your business in the last 2 years?
Yeah, so See the Signs essentially is a AI-driven software that's used by healthcare professionals to identify patients at risk of cancer and then recommend the most appropriate therapeutic pathway. So up until now, it's been used by healthcare professionals and in being able to funnel patients through and optimize early detection. When COVID hit and we saw many patients being isolated within their homes and actually being recommended not to attend hospitals, not to attend to see their healthcare professional during the pandemic unless it was life-threatening, we saw a complete wave of where we saw people presenting with early symptoms to now people sitting on their symptoms within their households. So what we were able to do is adapt our system to enable healthcare professionals to remotely risk assess patients within their own homes for the early signs and symptoms for cancer in order to ensure that those patients were still fast-tracked for access to cancer diagnostics and cancer referrals. I think overall we've seen that there's been an 85% reduction in the UK, in the US, and probably around the world in cancer diagnoses and cancer referrals, which is going to be a huge backlog as we come out of the pandemic and we look to the impact it's had on chronic conditions and long-term diseases, and also the impact it's had on being able to catch up on all those missed cancer diagnoses. What we've been really critical in being able to deliver is to say, if you are within your own house or home, you can be risk assessed for cancer, you can be assessed for that lesion or that lump or those symptoms, and be reassured to say these aren't risk signs for cancer. You can wait to see your doctor, or they are actually early signs and symptoms of cancer, and what we need to do to fast track you for cancer diagnostics or referrals. So we've been able to assess over 50,000 patients just this year alone, and being able to diagnose up to about 500 cases of cancer in the last 6 months of purely patients being risk assessed within their own homes and being able to funnel them through the system quick enough in order to get them onto the right treatment pathway, as our esteemed colleagues here were talking about, making sure they get access to diagnostics and access to treatment timely.
Right. Dr. Maheshwari, how about for you? Obviously, there have been fewer people going to their doctors, perhaps less of these advanced imaging services that you all do provide. Is there a way to reach out to increase the number? How are you experiencing coronavirus through your business?
Yeah. See, well, in radiology and diagnostics, unlike what Dr. Bakshi said, in diagnostics, the patient has to come to a diagnostic center or to a hospital to get the X-ray or the CT or the mammogram or the ultrasound. We don't yet have point of care, at-home diagnostics for a lot of that. So we certainly saw a huge dip in utilization of diagnostics during the pandemic, especially during the spikes. And one reason was that people were asked to stay home. The second reason was that the diagnostic centers, all the scanners were doing COVID patients. So you didn't, you had like the scanners just with these COVID patients. So cancer patients and other patients didn't want to come anywhere near a COVID patient. And so you landed up having a real reduction in diagnostics. So like, for instance, we do reporting for about 1,500 to 2,000 patients per day. And last year, when the pandemic, March, April, May, we were down to reporting for 100 patients a day. It was like a 90% drop in diagnostic volume. And as Dr. Bakshi said, that's all bouncing back now. We've already seen the bounce back. Patients are coming in now. Now there's not, at least in places where there's no COVID, the scanners are running 24/7 and everyone's kind of catching up, making up for missed time. But I do believe we're seeing late diagnoses, people who missed chemo cycles, tumors that have grown, and this huge backlog. We're already seeing our volumes have gone up much higher than pre-COVID with the same hospitals. So it just means the patients are coming back, the doctors are bringing them back, and hopefully this will correct in the next few months.
Dr. Gokte, did you see any fallout when it came to the pharmaceutical use? You would think that, in some cases, obviously chemotherapy, most specifically, patients do need to go to see their doctors. But in some cases, there are medicines that can be used and sent, through specialized pharmacies and that sort of thing. So were you able to reach the patients that you needed to reach through the coronavirus pandemic?
So there's a very interesting publication by about 41 institutes from India on what was the impact of the COVID pandemic on cancer care in India. And this represents about a third of cancer care in India, about 450,000 patients that these 40 institutes treat each year. And they actually looked at the overall impact, and they saw that anywhere between a 23 and a 55% reduction. And I'm just giving you an overall figure of the reduction in the number of surgeries, the number of chemotherapy sessions, the number of people visiting the hospital, new outpatient registrations, radiology procedures, radiotherapies for cancer, the number of pathologic biopsies and diagnoses that were done at a dramatic 50% nearly drop. But one of the interesting outcomes that we did see is a lot of people trying to move from injectable drugs more to the oral pills. And I think one of the highlights that the COVID pandemic has done has, I would say, given, if I can use the term, two somewhat positive things. One has been patients trying to find centers near that home for cancer care and other cares, and rather than always going perhaps hundreds of kilometers to a tertiary hospital like the Tata Memorial Hospital in Mumbai. because they just couldn't travel. They weren't allowed to come. They were scared to coming. They all started looking, is there an opportunity they can go nearby? I think the second positive thing that happened, as was highlighted, is that a lot of teleconsultations actually took place. The number of video consultations, especially follow-up, because usually in the first consultation, every physician would like a physical examination of the patient and a real detailed discussion face-to-face. But a lot of follow-ups actually started taking place on a video consultation. And thirdly, we saw some shift wherever appropriate from injectable drugs to oral pills. So this is, I would say, the overall impact of the mostly negative, but a few silver linings as well. And I think this is making us all of us think as how do we deliver complex cancer care in low and middle income countries where you have few oncologists, few centers which have enough expertise, and a public health system which is still not enough to really meet the demands of a $1.3 billion population, a lot of which still lives in rural areas and has still an educational status on cancer care, which is still quite low.
I think that's such a great point that there have been some pressures because of the coronavirus pandemic, that we've seen iteration in healthcare and how it's delivered, perhaps making things a little bit more efficient, and some innovation that's going to carry through in the years to come. And I take your point that there's certainly, millions, if not, billion people in India who need better access to care. We do see that throughout the entire world. Even in many urban centers, we see that some people don't go in to get the care that they need. Sometimes it's a lack of money, sometimes it's a lack of access, sometimes it's a lack of knowledge. So I'm wondering, Dr. Bakshi, maybe you can tell us, is there anything that doctors can do? Do we still need to work on the education piece in terms of informing patients and people in general in terms of what they need to be looking for? And are doctors doing that to the best of their ability currently when it comes to actually communicating to patients what to be on the lookout for cancer?
Yeah, I think a lot more can be done in this space, but I think the challenge is confounded by the fact that we don't have enough doctors for patients. And, to train a doctor, it takes over 10 years. So capacity is always going to be limited to be able to, most doctors and physicians are generalists at the first point of contact with patients. So are dealing with the whole plethora of disease, not just cancer. So the challenge is also, amongst cancer, there will be a diabetes backlog, a heart disease backlog. There'll be many, many other chronic healthcare conditions that need to be caught up upon. So I think how this conversation has touched upon using intelligent systems, clinical decision support tool, teleradiology, innovative methods to think about follow-up, virtual follow-up and virtual care in the disruptive new models of care, where we need to think about how we deliver care with a limited resource set of healthcare professionals is something we need to think about, because ultimately chronic diseases and non-communicable diseases are just on the increase as life expectancy increases. So we need to think about how we deliver care more sustainably, but also do the best we can for patients in raising awareness of symptoms and signs to be aware of. So new lumps, unexplained symptoms, bruising. There's so many cancer signs and symptoms that we should be training and educating patients upon. But again, these are just some symptoms within cancer, and we have the same for other healthcare conditions that we want to be empowering and educating patients on. And at the same time, with supporting healthcare professionals on the front line who still are dealing with the effects of the pandemic across the world and the new strains and the new waves that are emerging. So I think it's a very, very fine balancing act. And I think having Department of Health involved, public health involved, NGOs and charity sectors, and a collaborative approach is something that will be really meaningful in getting sustainable change.
And Dr. Maheshwari, are we seeing the same situation when it comes to these remote telemedicine, imaging? You guys obviously are very big in that particular area. I'm wondering if you need more support from governments. I know that certainly Singapore and other places have embraced the work that you guys are doing. Do you need more infrastructure? Does this industry need more infrastructure, or is it there already?
Yeah, I think that Corona did a big. It really has helped the cause of telemedicine, and I'll give you the example in India. For instance, before March 2020, telemedicine was illegal in this country. In the sense there were no guidelines that said you could do a video consult with a doctor. So you had these cases of doctors being put in jail if they had answered on WhatsApp and the patient got into trouble. But when the pandemic hit, the Ministry of Health in India legalized telemedicine in March 2020, and that's opened up the country. So you now have patients in remote parts of the all over the country who can access doctors in cities, bigger hospitals, get second opinions, and it's really opened it up. So I would say that's the biggest thing that government has done. So one, if they can kind of just allow medicine to practice the way it's meant to be practiced, this will just grow. The second area government can help certainly is with infrastructure in terms of bandwidth. For instance, a lot of the rural areas still don't have great bandwidth. So even if they want to do telemedicine or teleradiology, they're limited. The third is in what we just talked about, which is messaging. I mean, you don't need a doctor to tell a patient how to examine a breast and look for a lump. You can do that with very active public health messages. And that's something, with the pandemic, we had so much information. I hope we now carry that same medical information to people on different diseases and do one disease at a time till it sticks in everybody's head. So I think, yes, I think governments have done a lot. It's really up to all of us also to take that forward.
Okay, and then our last question, Dr. Gokte, one of the issues, obviously, when it comes to cancer medicine is the cost of care. I know that's something that CIPLA has been working on, focused on significantly. We're getting to the end of our panel here, so I'm wondering if you can just touch on the financial implications, access to cancer care when the financial piece is a toxic issue for many patients.
So I think for most patients in India and other countries where it is out of pocket, there is a very, very significant financial toxicity. So it couldn't be more important to diagnose cancers early, because then the amount of treatments that you needed are much lesser and the cost is, of course, much lower. So I would reiterate what my other panelists have said. But equally so, when you really need treatment, as drugs start going off patent, clearly the cost dramatically comes down. We have seen with imatinib and some of the other targeted therapies, the cost comes down tenfold. Is it affordable to everybody? Perhaps not yet, but far more accessible than what it was. And I'm sure we need an HIV kind of moment in many of these chronic diseases, which are very complex and difficult to treat. We've had this in the COVID pandemic. Look at the example of remdesivir, licensed by the innovator company to half a dozen Indian companies, and you see the prices just going down. The same thing has happened with another COVID drug called molnupiravir. We've seen the pricing in the US versus what the pricing could be in India. So I think we need such kind of moments all the time, and especially for a condition like cancer, where the costs in the US, for example, we know of average cost of new cancer drugs is about $200,000 plus per year, where you need long-term treatment. So I think we need these kinds of moments for cancer, where it could be a kind of a collaboration between the innovator company and generic companies for the low and middle income countries. There could be some governments and other bodies stepping in to bring this together so that treatment really becomes accessible to more. And I think there's a lot more that can be done in this area, and we have some lessons to learn from the past.
Perfect. Well, thank you all three of you. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a great panel. It is an incredibly important topic. Obviously, one of the leading causes of death worldwide, by far one of the most concerning conditions that makes people have difficulty sleeping at night. So thank you for the work that all three of you are doing. Thank you for participating in our panel, and we're looking forward to speaking with you guys in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Deirdre Hipwell. I cover healthcare for Bloomberg in Europe. We all know there is an increasing focus on the wider toll that the pandemic is taking on health systems worldwide and the knock-on impact that's having on missed cancer diagnoses and treatments. This is perhaps particularly the case in Africa, which is still grappling with the pandemic and a slower vaccination rate and health systems that are sometimes lacking in infrastructure. With me today to talk about these issues is Keller Ronaldo, founder and CEO of Zipline, which designs, makes and operates drones. He has a hugely impressive CV. He's been involved with a number of startups, and he's been doing a lot of work in Rwanda and Ghana in helping deliver blood to urgent medical situations and cancer treatments to patients in urgent need during the pandemic. Also with him is Dr. Joel Mubiligi, the Exec Director of Partners in Health, a non-profit global health organization. He started out as a physician in Rwanda. He spent time working for the Ministry of Health. And as an exec at Partners in Health, he's in charge of more than 200 people helping to integrate and improve patient care in Rwanda, a country devastated by genocide and a health system which for many years was struggling. Keller, I'd like to come to you. We're really interested to know a bit more about Zipline and what it's doing in Rwanda. And I've heard you talk about how it's not correct to call it just a drone company and it's an instant logistics provider. And I thought you could start us off by telling us what exactly Zipline does.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest misconception about what we do. Sometimes people look at Zipline and they see the drone and that's the exciting thing. It's the sexy thing. And so it's sort of what people focus on. But of course, the reality is that none of the partners that Zipline works with, whether it's Partners in Health or it's the government of Rwanda or the government of Ghana or health systems across the US, really want or care about drones. What they care about is being able to make sure that a medical product goes from point A to point B fast enough to save somebody's life. And our goal from day one when we founded the company was to build an instant logistics system for medicine to basically approximate teleportation in terms of enabling health systems to send exactly what's needed, where it's needed, when it's needed. We launched in Rwanda in 2016, and originally we're focused on delivering blood products. Today we deliver about 250 different medical products, essentially the entire public healthcare supply chain in this way, using instant autonomous electric vehicles that weigh about 50 pounds to deliver something to any hospital or primary care facility when something's needed. And over the last year, when the pandemic began to cause lockdowns across many countries, Rwanda included, we were able to partner with Partners in Health to begin sending cancer medications directly to patients, to primary care facilities right next to where they lived, to ensure that elderly or immunocompromised people who were depending on these treatments with their lives could still get access to them even when they weren't supposed to be traveling across the country.
That's really interesting. Joel, can you talk a bit more about how that's actually done in practical terms? I mean, patients have to know how to use the treatments. They maybe need some discussions. How has it actually worked? And, specifically for, cancer patients where often the treatment regimens can be, quite complex.
Yeah, so when we started this collaboration with Zipline, it was at the time of the first lockdown, total lockdown in the country in March last year. And at that time, we had already patient in care who was coming back to our clinic on a monthly basis to take their medicine and usually oral pills. So what we decided at that time, we had to divide our patients into different groups. The patients who needs to receive chemotherapy intravenous at the hospital setting was still needed to be at the health facility place and the clinic. So we had to organize logistic around with the Rwanda Biomedical Center and the district hospital close to them to drive them up to the place where they can receive that care. But we also had another group of patients who have been on their treatment for long, mainly patients with CML, chronic myeloid leukemia, who already knew how to take their medicine. So these were not patients who were new into the treatment, but a patient who have been receiving their treatment chronically. So that group really didn't need to come to the facility. And that was the group that we identified as a group that could use the service of Zipline to get the medicine get closer to them. And we also had to work with the nearby community health workers, nearby health centers to make sure that the drug is delivered to the patient. So it was really an assessment of who can take that medicine and receive that and take that by their own. So usually patients who have already been in their treatment for a while, and also connecting with their nearby health system to support as well.
And how many people would you say were treated during the pandemic and received their treatments via drone delivery? And I know it was a response to the pandemic, but do you think this is something that you're going to scale out even further for cancer treatment going forward?
So that's something that we are exploring now for the same reason as I've outlined. If you consider patients who are taking chemotherapy, especially oral way, that does not need really specialized skills to give them intravenous treatment, there is really little reason for them to travel long distance, especially if they are stable. What we need is really having at least a system where they can go for usual checkup by a doctor on a monthly basis per se. But really getting their treatment, refilling their pills should be something that we can organize around and have a system to deliver to them. So the experience of zipline or using a drone to have that closer to them and working with the nurses and the community health workers closer to them to make sure that the drug is delivered to them have been an experience that have been eye-opening to us. And we're looking into how do we do that, not only for that type of cancer, but even other non-communicable diseases. If you think about diabetic patients who need to take their insulin and so forth. So these are the things that we are really exploring. But the reality is it has to be built on already an existing infrastructure. You know, it will be difficult in a setting where the closest healthcare professional is, 2-3 hours driving from the person. That will be very, very, very difficult because we also need a point of reference where it is delivered. And we also need to make sure that there is a community health workers who can identify the patient and follow them closely. For example, in Rwanda, the government system has close to 45,000 community health workers across the country, 500 health centers across the country. So all of those are already infrastructure that a technology, that a drone come and build up on it to really make it as easier as possible for the patients.
That's interesting. And Kella, what was the accuracy been like in this program? Because that's often a question people ask or think about when they're thinking about drone deliveries. And you must have hours of flying experience and data now. Can you tell us a bit about how accurate the program was, and I guess what your learnings were from that, and how that might translate into either further rollout in Rwanda or indeed in other countries?
Yeah, not hours. Actually, at this point, we have millions of hours of safe flight data. So orders of magnitude. But the funny thing is that when we are initially launching, so we initially launched by serving 21 hospitals. Today, Zipline serves about 2,500 hospitals and primary care facilities across Rwanda, Ghana, and the United States. And whenever we're adding a new hospital to the network, there's always this moment of like, I don't really think this is going to work. It seems like science fiction. And then 7 days later, we see doctors and nurses using it as though they've always had this. And they're like, yeah, of course we have drones that deliver these products, you idiot. Like, what other way would we deliver this? So it's really cool to see the way that something goes from kind of science fiction to normal in just a couple of days. Humans are very able to adapt to things. And I think one of the reasons it's been easy for people to adapt is that the system works more reliably than traditional logistics. We guaranteed a 97% service uptime when we launched the service. We ended up achieving a 99.5% service uptime, which is much better than any other logistics service out there. And so, at the end of the day, doctors and nurses, they care about reliability. They want predictability. They want it to be fast. It's pretty simple. Like, nobody cares how it's being delivered. No one no one cares how fancy the system is or what the technology is. Doctors and nurses just want to do their jobs and be able to save patients' lives. And I think this is an area where technology has advanced really quickly and where it's making it possible to just provide a different class of logistics that then unlocks this transformative potential for health systems that enable them to provide care in new ways, shift the paradigm, use decentralized care in virtual hospital and telepresence to reach people closer to where they live.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of Zipline, obviously you've had a recent funding round. Are you set up to roll this out further in Africa and in the US, which obviously a huge market potentially for Zipline? Do you feel that Zipline, you're ready to go? You've got the funding necessary to help roll this technology out?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, when we were seeing the data that was coming back from the work we've done with the Ministry of Health of Rwanda, with Partners in Health, with the government of Ghana and new countries that Zipline's launching in. We launched in the US a year and a half ago. We started to realize, okay, this is generalized infrastructure, and not only can it save health systems money, but it can save lives. And so we do feel there's a moral imperative at this point to roll this out in many other countries and make it broadly available. The funding that we raised in December is really designed to make sure that Zipline is ready to make all the investments necessary to bring this to from 25 million people that we serve today to 250 million people about 2 years from now.
And what is the biggest hurdle, do you think? It seems like you can get doctors and patients on board quite quickly. Is it the regulatory framework that's the biggest hurdle when you're thinking about expansion?
It's a very good question. To be honest, doctors and nurses have been many of our strongest champions. They're actually the people who get it the fastest. It's amazing, and I also have to say, I mean, Partners in Health has been such an incredible partner to Zipline over the last 2 years. And I was reflecting on that today because a lot of folks in global public health have actually not been champions of Zipline. And I think the difference is that Partners in Health is this incredible organization that is on the ground doing the real work of administering a lot of these health systems, operating hospitals in complicated, hard places. So I would say, our strongest champions have been those partners who are on the ground doing the work with us. And then some of the people who have been expanding this infrastructure harder, I would say it's probably the folks in global public health who are not really in the countries that they're trying to serve and have less of a sense for what will work in these countries and what the countries need.
Sure. And Joel, Rwanda seems to be becoming quite a center of excellence for cancer care and treatment in Africa. What role is Partners in Health playing in that? And do you think, this is going to continue, which is a remarkable turnaround for a country which had such devastation only a few decades ago?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously, this is going to continue. Just yesterday, we launched the government, the Ministry of Health launched the National Strategic Plan for Non-Communicable Diseases, including cancer. And it's a very ambitious plan of hundreds of billions of money needed to really accomplish in the next 5 years. So definitely is going to continue. And for us, it has been a dream come true, really, in terms of having this plan outlined, as we have been working closely with the Rwanda Biomedical Center, the Ministry of Health in developing the plan, and also using the experience that we had in Butaro Cancer Center. That was the first cancer center of excellence per se that we started in 2012. So we had a lot of data in terms of type of cancers, treatments, protocols, and so forth that have been informing that plan for the past 8-9 years. So definitely the work will continue. It's a high priority for the government. Non-communicable diseases, like many other countries across the globe, we're experiencing what we call now a double burden of disease. So where non-communicable diseases, including cancers, are becoming the main drivers of mortality and morbidity in our country. So it's a high priority, obviously, for the country. And the setting that have already been there with our partnership and the investment of the government of Rwanda. Only 2-3 years ago, the government opened the first radiotherapy center, and more are still coming. So this is going to continue through great partnership, great vision, and a commitment for investment from the government.
Super. Well, thank you both very much. You're doing a lot of interesting things with cancer treatment in Africa. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Welcome to all our viewers from around the world. My name is Sam Fazeli. I am the head of research for Bloomberg Intelligence in the EMEA region, and also the one of the pharmaceutical analysts in the BI, Bloomberg Intelligence team, currently responsible for covering the large pharmaceutical industry, which of course involves a lot of oncology and cancer drugs. So what I'm here to talk to you today about is how the revolution, which is the only word I can use to describe how the treatment of cancer has moved on in the past 20 years in the field, and also how that has created opportunity and potential, unfortunately, for health inequities and inequalities. So I'm just going to go back a few decades, not that far back. Even as late as the 90s, the only weapon that physicians had for treating cancers of most different types was to use chemotherapy. Everybody is familiar with that phrase. Chemotherapy, by definition, was designed to kill fast-dividing cells and to spare as much as possible the rest of the human body. So the idea being that tumors are fast-dividing cells, therefore chemotherapy should interfere with their ability to divide and hence stop the tumor or kill it, and not cause too many side effects. But of course, we all know what some of the classic side effects of chemotherapy are, the ones that are most visible, which are the loss of hair, alopecia, and problems with the epithelial cells in the mouth, in the throat, etc., all to do with the fact that they are fast-dividing cells. And then what happened was that the biology around the understanding of cancer, the evolution of cancer, and how it develops and how it metastasizes, i.e. leaves the primary tumor and goes to other parts of the body, which is often what is the final thing that kills, unfortunately, the patients who suffer from cancer. As the understanding of that biology improved, as the understanding of the immune system improved, several events happened in the past 20, 25 years, I would say. It all started by understanding the mechanisms by which cancer cells find the genetic mutations and what those genetic mutations actually impact, such as the so-called kinases that are driver mutations that cause a cell that's perfectly normal one day to become cancerous, i.e. divide without control. So chemists and pharmaceutical industry and scientists were able to develop drugs that inhibit those specific mutations, or at least the protein product of those mutations, so kinase inhibitors, as they're called. And those were some of the first treatments that became more and more specific for targeting cancer cells. And then, of course, we had the advent of antibodies, which is something that started in the 80s and then became much more controlled and better developed, and ways of making it so that your body, when you get the antibodies, doesn't see them as foreign proteins and react to them. And those antibodies were directed against things, molecules, proteins, so-called antigens, that are specific to tumors. So some of the well-known ones, which are now, I could say, generic or biosimilar in the world of pharmaceuticals, are Herceptin, Avastin, and Rituxan. These were major sellers in the world of oncology drugs, and they had very specific targets, and therefore they were able to give you better cancer result at a more controlled side effect profile. And then everything has mushroomed since then. You have ways of harnessing the immune system, or at least unleashing the immune system to attack the tumors. Those are called checkpoint inhibitors. Again, antibodies, but they stop the cloak that the tumor puts around itself to stop it, to make it invisible to the immune system. In many patients, it removes that cloak so that the immune system, the so-called cellular immune system, the T cells of the immune system, can attack the tumors. And you're getting phenomenal effects here. And we've seen data from some clinical trials where you're basically curing a percentage of patients, but of course not all. And then we have other ways of, current ways of delivering chemotherapy, but much more targeted. So you're marrying the antibodies that were developed to target tumors with a chemotherapy payload, and therefore that chemotherapy ends up only in the tumor, or mostly in the tumor. And then you get phenomenal efficacy. All of this has happened in the past 20 years, and you're getting continually evolving better and better treatment of cancers of all types. Example, I think I have heard physicians who treat melanoma say, in a normal world, before the advent of immunotherapy for cancer, they would perhaps write several, unfortunately, death certificates in a week. After the advent of immunotherapy, which was first approved for melanoma, that went down to a few in a month. That's significant. Unfortunately, most of these therapies, number one, require expensive and difficult to do for non-specialized centers diagnostics. You need to identify the tumor. Is this the right drug for it, or is another drug right for this particular cancer? And I'm talking even within one cancer, which we call, say, lung cancer, there are so many subdivisions of it. So you need these expensive diagnostics. And at the same time, each time one of these therapies was approved, the price went up. So what in reality has happened is that we're dealing with a world that's able to treat cancer really well in rich countries, but not so well in the poorer countries. And the poorer you are, the harder it gets. And I'm pretty sure that immunotherapy is actually probably not available even in some countries which are at the low end of the income range. And on top of that, you've got new diagnostics that are coming that try and use blood markers to identify people early on at risk of cancer. And even that is going to require expensive equipment and expensive systems and ability to be able to follow that and treat patients. So unfortunately, the revolution in oncology is leaving a large proportion of the human population behind. And that's something that we need to really think very hard about. How do we fix that problem? Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emma Court. I cover healthcare here at Bloomberg News. Everything really from COVID-19 to some of the latest treatments in a wide array of diseases. Today we're here to talk about the next big thing in cancer care. Curing cancer remains one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century. In this session, we ask what next generation cancer treatments are being developed and what has the most potential to change how patients receive care. We look at some of the new technologies and therapies that could get us closer to making cancer a manageable disease. Here with me today is Robert Stone, President and CEO of City of Hope, a leading cancer treatment and research center based in California. Stone is a lawyer by training and has been at City of Hope since joining the legal department there 25 years ago. Thanks for being here with us today, Robert.
Thank you, Emma. It's my pleasure to spend a few minutes with you.
So I think it might be helpful to start off by talking about cancer in a kind of a big picture fashion. It's obviously a group of many different diseases, and there have been some really dramatic changes in terms of treatment of cancer in the last few years. I'm thinking specifically of things like immunotherapies, which harness the body's natural immune system to try to rev it up and better treat cancer. As well as other innovations like using cell therapies. I'm hoping you could kind of lay the landscape for us a little bit. Where are we right now, and where do you see cancer care going from here? You know, I think everyone watching here today is really interested in sort of what are the most promising new therapeutic innovations that are coming around in the near term.
Well, Emma, as you said, cancer is no longer recognized as one condition, but as multiple conditions. And with the emergence of gene sequencing technology, it soon may be viewed as potentially hundreds of conditions, and your cancer is going to be categorized by the mutation of your genes, and it leads to a wonderful and wondrous era of innovation and discovery. So you've named quite a few. Cellular therapy, immunotherapy, using your body to fight cancer, recognize and fight cancer. Precision medicine, the ability to have highly specialized and personalized treatment plans and options so that we can benefit patients on a unique basis. It's an exciting time. I think there's a disconnect, however, and it's where I think the field is going to lead. There is such hope created by these innovations and discovery, but there's a gap that continues to develop and widen for those who actually have access to the discoveries. And I think the future, we all have to focus on how do we get the right treatment to the right individuals, but at the right time. And you have to recognize that the best chance for a cure is your first chance for a cure.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It actually leads me right into my next question. Unfortunately, as we know, what kinds of care you get really can vary depending on where you get it, right? And hopefully you're lucky enough to be able to access care, unfortunately. So, we know cancer patients can sometimes travel really far to get access to certain specialists, for instance, or participate in new clinical trials. What do you see making the biggest difference for patients who are, not necessarily getting treated at a top-notch center like City of Hope? I know you guys are doing some work in this area as well to try to kind of change the access paradigm.
Well, so I think we have to do two things. One, we have to be as innovative with our delivery mechanisms as we are with our scientific innovations. City of Hope is one of 51 comprehensive cancer centers as designated by the National Cancer Institute. It's at these large research and academic centers where a lot of the innovation is discovered and first taken to patients. Yet 80% of the cancer care in this country is delivered in the community setting, and we have to bridge the gap so that patients who are seen in the community are able to get access to these therapies. I have more than 100 doctors in our community network. They're general oncologists. They're tremendous doctors. They see many patients each day. They provide comfort to their patients. They provide great care to their patients, but they can't keep up with all of the discovery that's happening on such a frenzied pace. So you have to be able to tie those two places together. And second, you have to be willing to find partnerships and realize that what we can do with like-minded organizations is profoundly more impactful than any one institution can do alone.
Yeah, and I know you're kind of working on a partnership like that, right? This partnership called Access Hope.
We are. So Access Hope is a way of reaching out to employers. We have 20 of the Fortune 500 companies right now as clients, and the idea is bridging innovation with site of care. So we partner with community oncologists. So if an employee of one of these employers is diagnosed with cancer, or a family member of one of these employers is diagnosed with cancer, we support the community oncologist with getting the right treatment plan, with looking at genomic information, and with making sure that the diagnosis is correct. And recently, Northwestern University and Dana-Farber Cancer Center joined us, and it's one example of how organizations who are dedicated to eliminating cancer can come together to make a difference. It brings to mind one other thing, which is we also, as we come together, have the need to advocate for the cancer patient, have the need to make sure that the cancer patient gets timely care. City of Hope led a consortium out here in California to draft, and then it was passed by the California State Legislature, a cancer patient's Bill of Rights that gave dictated what the rights were for a cancer patient to timely access to information in a culturally relevant manner, to clinical trials. It allowed us to make sure that your outcome isn't dictated by your zip code, that it's dictated by where the best treatments are for your particular cancer.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought the Access Hope model is interesting because you hear more about these kinds of partnerships now, the idea that you could take a specialist or someone who's a really kind of top-notch academic and partner with more people in the community, experts and clinicians in the community to sort of increase the realm of what's possible and also kind of consult as well, right? I mean, we can all use a little help now and then. I think, as you're pointing out, not everyone still has access to this kind of treatment. I'm wondering, you mentioned personalized medicine, this idea of precision treatments for diseases like cancer, and it's a term you hear all the time in healthcare, and it's something that can also seem pretty vague, right? Like, what does that really mean in practice to have your treatment highly personalized for you? So I'm hoping you can kind of explain to us a little bit, unpack what that looks like, to a patient who's getting this kind of treatment.
Sure. Well, let's take a step back. We talked about earlier that cancer is a series of subtypes and a number of diseases, not one disease, and that it eventually, I think in the not too distant future, will be categorized by your mutation. We're still in the infancy and early stages of understanding how certain mutations can be impacted by different treatments and different treatment options. But we're learning everything from early genomic screening, which leads to an understanding of your individual condition, your individual cancer. And it leads to an earlier diagnosis. It allows us to catch cancer when it's easier to treat. It ensures that we're putting patients on the most appropriate treatment plan. And having the right treatment plan early in the cancer journey, just by definition, will lead to better outcomes. And it's interesting. One of the things we haven't yet talked about, but it impacts both the innovations that we started with and personalized medicine, is then access to clinical trials. And at City of Hope, 1 in every 4 patients that comes to us enrolls in a treatment clinical trial. And what that shows me is that the science is moving so quickly and the knowledge is moving so quickly that we have the ability to bring new therapies to bear before they even become the standard of care.
Yeah, that's really interesting. When you think about new therapies and how that treatment landscape is evolving, this idea of precision medicine does seem to loom really large. It's in fact, probably largely because we have these tools that allow us to have such deep genetic insights into cancers. How do you see cancer treatments evolving because of that? I think one thing that I know you're really interested in is how cancer treatment may change. Now we think of it so predominantly in terms of where the cancer originated, right? Is it a breast cancer? Is it a lung cancer? And I think you were describing that that idea is going to shift as we have better genetic insights.
Yeah, so I don't want to put you on the spot, so I will just use you as an example. 1 in 3 men in this country, 1 in 3 women in this country will have a cancer diagnosis in their lifetime. And if you think about how many people will have cancer, and then if you've been lucky enough not to have cancer, chances are you have a family member who has had cancer, or you have a friend who has had cancer, and it impacts everyone. And what precision medicine, one aspect of precision medicine one aspect of what it allows us to do is it allows us to look for risks, not just for you for early detection, but also your family members. We can inform family members of genetic results so that they know, are they high risk or average risk for cancer, and does that mean they should take different approaches, early detection, have more often, be screened more often, or are they at lower risk, in which case they don't need that as much early detection. That's where precision medicine can tailor treatments, not just for an individual cancer patient, but for society as a whole. And if we go back to where we started, which is this widening gap between the innovations like precision medicine and the access to those innovations, it highlights why having a tie between the academic centers and the community providers is so crucial. Things like Access Hope, things like the advocacy that I described earlier are part of the future, and I think the next frontier.
Yeah, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the sort of, when you talk about next generation treatments, clinical trials are a big focus, especially in cancer care. How do we make that access better? Can you talk a little bit, especially with a focus on equity, right? If typical patients in the community can't access clinical trials as well as they can at a big center like City of Hope, how equitable are these treatments really being parceled out?
Well, it is a constant area of focus to make sure that we have diversity in our clinical trial enrollments. I mentioned earlier that City of Hope has 1 in every 4 patients are on a clinical trial. That translates into, at any given time, we have 1,000 clinical trials available, and often the most appropriate and best care for an individual is through a clinical trial. We have to be able to communicate better and offer these clinical trials in a way that is culturally sensitive and addresses fears that people have. I mean, I've seen the fears range from reduction in quality of life to they're concerned about taking a placebo to the inconvenience of traveling. Think about it. If you are on a clinical trial and you need to be at a doctor's office in 5 days in a row or 5 days out of 10, and you have to travel because it's at a community, it's at an academic center, you're not going to enroll in that trial because a disproportionate number of these trials are at academic centers, and that impacts the elderly and the low income even more. And so this idea of closing the gap and making not just care but trials available in the community is really important to solving that problem.
Absolutely. And I think you spoke really well to that. Thank you so much, Robert, for being here with us today. And thank you so much to everyone for tuning in. We really appreciate it.
Emma, it's been my pleasure. It's great to see you. I look forward to next time.
Hi, I'm Susie Ring, and I'm a healthcare reporter at Bloomberg News in London. Today, I have the great privilege of being joined by Professor Adrian Hill, the director of the Jenner Institute at the University of Oxford, one of the masterminds behind the COVID-19 vaccine. We're going to talk today about another vaccine that Professor Hill and his team are working on against cancer, and how in the wake of the pandemic, the discussion has really opened up about the potential for vaccines in other disease areas. So thank you so much, Professor Hill, for joining me today. Much appreciated. Do you want to just start by telling us a little bit about the vaccine you're working on and its genesis?
We have been working on vaccines specifically designed to trigger the cellular arm of the immune system for nearly 20 years now. And the COVID vaccine actually came out of that program. So we're using an adenoviral vector, as people know widely now, really to induce both antibodies and T cells. But we chose adenoviruses because in our view, they were and probably still are the best way of getting very potent cellular immunity, particularly from CD8 T cells. And we were actually doing lots of studies in humans of cellular immunity and how we could induce it, not for cancer, not for COVID, but actually for malaria for many years. And there is an unusual situation where at one of the stages of the malaria parasite's life cycle, which is complex and I won't bore you with, only CD8 T cells will work. So that was a very good way of really focusing in on that arm of the immune system, which of course is the most potent way of designing a vaccine to tackle cancer, because these CD8 T cells are killer cells. And we worked out immunization regimes that would maximize their numbers circulating in the blood quite early on. And then that vaccine came to be used for many other things, including COVID. So where we are today is using that viral vector technology, as it's called, to induce a strong CD8 T cell response to cancer antigens, and trying to boost that to even higher levels by using a second viral vector. And you may remember that mix and match regimes like that are very much in vogue for for COVID immunization. What we've been doing over the last few years is focusing on prostate cancer. And we chose this because it's probably one of the more doable, achievable vaccines to make against cancer, because prostate cells grow pretty slowly. There are some good target antigens like PSA or STIAP or PAP and so on. And we've now put a cassette of those target antigens into those viral vectors. In one phase 2 trial that we've completed, we have looked at the immunogenicity and potential efficacy of a vaccine encoding a long-standing cancer antigen called 5T4 against patients with late-stage prostate cancer. And we've seen some early encouraging signals there in our university-run trial. But that program now has been handed over to the licensee of the chimp adenovirus technology, which is Vaccitech PLC, and they're undertaking 2 trials with the same technology, one of them in earlier stage prostate cancer, men who've, say, had surgery and are worried about recurrence, and vaccinating those as soon as there might be any hint of recurrence. And the other trial is an ambitious one with Cancer Research UK as well as Vaccitech supporting it in late-stage lung cancer, where we'll take men with checkpoint inhibitors and also receiving, with their checkpoint inhibitor, chemotherapy, and adding a vaccine into that treatment regime.
You mentioned the decision to use the chimpanzee adenovirus because you saw it as the most potent vector. We're obviously seeing a lot of discussion now about the use of mRNA. You will obviously have the first marketed products using mRNA in light of COVID-19. What do you see as the benefits of using the adenovirus over mRNA? What are the pros and cons and the decision behind taking your approach rather than an mRNA approach?
Yeah, well, a year ago, nobody could have answered that question because there weren't enough data published on RNA vaccines. We've now seen a lot, and they do induce, as we've seen, very potent antibody responses, particularly neutralizing antibodies. They do induce T cells as well, but it turns out that even though on an ELISpot assay you can see T cells induced early by an RNA vaccine, they're mainly CD4 T cells. There are some CD8 T cells, but certainly not as much as you would get with an adenovirus. On the other hand, just in the last few months, there have been some studies where you give the adenovirus first and then give the RNA. And there it looks a bit more interesting because the adenovirus primes the CD8 T cell response. And it's always harder to prime than to boost an immune response with vaccines. And there are some worthwhile looking CD8 T cells. So maybe RNA will come into play as a booster regimen for cancer. And indeed, there's been one company on the West Coast, Gritstone, who have begun to assess that clinically. So the exciting thing about RNA is that it's new and we're still really learning how to use it. But for the moment, the most potent regimens remain a pair of viral vectors.
And you mentioned, obviously you and your team have been working on products like this for many years. In the public's mind, COVID-19 has really brought vaccines to the fore, and the idea of cancer vaccines, while we do know there are some prophylactic vaccines out there with HPV and others, seem quite a new innovation. Is this slightly hyped because of COVID-19? Can we expect to see results and a number of cancer vaccines, do you think, in the next few years? Or is it the reality that, as per pre-COVID-19, these processes take a lot of time and we shouldn't get too excited about there being too much on the market in the near future?
So the way I'd answer that is to say what we've really learned from COVID-19 is that you can develop vaccines an awful lot faster than we routinely do. So 10 years is too long. That's not necessary. You should know whether your product is working or not in a shorter period of time. But what the really good news is that there is going to be more investment in vaccines, in vaccine companies, in vaccine technologies. And of course, cancer is one of the great prizes. And I'm sure we can vaccinate against cancer. As you mentioned a moment ago, we're able to do cancers where they're triggered by a viral antigen and prevent them. Probably some of the first cancer vaccines that will work really well will be cancers that have those viral antigens in them. So HPV, human papillomavirus, is looking promising. Hepatitis B as a cause of liver cancer is certainly of interest, particularly if you could get that early and clear the virus when the liver hasn't transformed to malignancy as yet. But, the ultimate goal is to be able to somehow break tolerance against the unique antigens that are in cancer cells. I think that's going to take a bit longer. But remember, the advantage of cancer vaccines is they don't have to work 80 or 90% like a COVID vaccine has been working. If you were to get 30%, 40% more efficacy by using viral vector vaccines, which, as we've seen in the last year, are not that difficult to produce and can be produced inexpensively, that would be a wonderful new approach in cancer that would not replace checkpoint inhibitors, would probably be used with them, would not replace other cancer therapies, but might be a very valuable new approach that would be very specific in its targeting. And remember, these vaccines we've been having are mild enough to give to healthy people, and they're fine a day or two later in all cases. And in cancer, this would be a very mild treatment.
And as you mentioned, we've learned from the pandemic that timelines can be accelerated, clinical trials can be run faster when needed. Is there any changes that you're taking in approach to the clinical trial that's going to be starting this year for the lung cancer patients for this vaccine?
No real changes. And in fact, that trial has been planned for a little while and is kicking off roundabout now. I think that what we are likely to see is a lot more interest. And of course, recruitment rates can be rate limiting in lots of cancer trials. I think now that the public are familiar with the power of vaccines, we'll have more people volunteering to participate in those trials, particularly if they have serious cancer. We're already seeing people with the smaller breasts that are already showing a lot of interest, and I suspect those trials will go faster as a result.
And in terms of regimen, again, we're currently thinking about vaccines in the sense of you have maybe 2 doses. We're now looking at booster doses. When it comes to the context of cancer, what will we be talking? Is this something that would become part of someone's regular treatment forevermore? Is it something they would have temporarily every 6 months for a couple of years until a tumor had reduced? What would be the prognosis and the use of vaccines in that prognosis?
I think we'll be using vaccines differently. As you say, we're not going to be giving just, say, 2 shots and a month apart and then you're done. It's harder to vaccinate against cancer fundamentally because you're trying to deal with a self-antigen much of the time, or an antigen that's not very different from a self-antigen. So I think you will need rounds of vaccination. For example, with our 2 viral vectors, we give them as a pair some weeks apart, then come back maybe a few months later, give them again. And it may well be that we give multiple rounds and multiple immunizations and keep going to control cancer and to increase lifespan. I think that's a realistic early objective. We have the big advantage that we know what we're trying to do. We're trying to induce a very specific type of T cell that we can measure, and you can go and look for immunization regimens that maximize the number of T cells that are specific for the cancer. And one of the approaches that several companies are interested in now is not just giving an intramuscular immunization in a routine way, but actually giving the vaccine intravenously. Now, that would be very cumbersome for delivering a COVID vaccine, but of course it's entirely straightforward in a cancer patient who is already receiving intravenous checkpoint inhibitors and other medications. So that's certainly going to be explored. It's clear that there is a new way of immunizing that is not priming and boosting. It's called priming and targeting the T cells. So you give the first dose as a standard intramuscular immunization, and then you give the booster doses intravenously, and that actually brings the antigen that you want an immune response to the target tissue. So typically to the liver, but it could be to a mucosal surface, it could be to an accessible tumor, and then hopefully you would target in humans, as well as in the experimental animals where this has been developed, those CD8 T cells to the tumor where they would kill it or at least slow its growth.
And as we discussed, there are some prophylactic vaccines out there already for HPV and others that you would see adolescents receive, for example. Is there anything in the therapeutic vaccine studies that could inform the development of prophylactic vaccines at all? Can we see links there? So if somebody had a predisposition to cancer for hereditary reasons or other, anything from the therapeutic side that can inform the prophylactic side?
Yes, it works both ways. The therapeutic side learns from the prophylactic side, and there are far more prophylactic than therapeutic vaccines. But we do more interesting things in the therapeutic space. I've mentioned one of them, changing the route of immunization, giving intravenous dosing. We also use more complex regimens, trying to really maximize the immune response that we can generate. And I'm pretty sure that the investment that we're seeing in cancer vaccines at the moment, which is substantial and growing, is going to have beneficial effects for vaccinating against viruses that we would like to prevent. So, for example, infectious mononucleosis is not the most serious infection we get in teenage years, except when it can turn into something that triggers cancer or multiple sclerosis. So it would be nice to have a vaccine against Epstein-Barr virus to stop us getting infected, as well as one that would target tumors like nasopharyngeal carcinoma, which is triggered by that viral infection and is a horrendously rapidly progressing tumor in many cases. So yes, lots of to and fro.
And we talked about cancer obviously today, but there seems to be kind of a growing list of diseases that could be treated using vaccination. We've all sort of become armchair vaccinologists during the pandemic. So I know there's a lot of focus on this right now. And for people like yourself, you've obviously been working on a number of these things for years. Do you see this as being a sort of key moment in time where we're going to just see the landscape grow incredibly in terms of the potential for vaccines?
I think that has started already. Some of the targets are extremely important medical conditions. For example, Alzheimer's disease, there have been vaccines tested in the clinic, not hugely successfully, but I think they will come. I think in 30 years' time, most research vaccinology will be in the space of treating chronic diseases and not treating microbes. I think we'll have covered most of the main microbes by then. And if you think about it, we're not doing with a vaccine very much that's different from giving a monoclonal antibody. In many areas, we are following monoclonal antibodies, which can be used to identify the exact target you want the immune response to go for. You have to keep giving those, there's not a durable immune response. So if you can identify the target antigens, say in a chronic disease condition, maybe a self-antigen with a monoclonal antibody that is shown to work, what a lot of vaccinologists are doing then is taking that antigen and developing it into a vaccine and generating a natural immune response rather than having to give a monoclonal antibody for perhaps many years.
Lots to get excited about. Thank you so much, Professor Hill. Really, really appreciate your time and looking forward to following the trials as they go forwards.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm James Payton. I'm a healthcare journalist at Bloomberg News in London. Like many of you, I've been focused on COVID-19 over the past 18 months. The pandemic, needless to say, has dominated the agenda because of the health and economic devastation that it's caused. But we're also very interested in exploring the impact of the crisis on other areas, especially cancer, and learning more about the ripple effect that we're bound to see. And today, I'm speaking with two experts in oncology to shed light on that topic. Camille Hertzka is Vice President and Medical Head of U.S. Oncology for AstraZeneca, the global pharmaceutical company. Anil Rustagi is the Interim Executive Vice President and Dean of the Faculties of Health Science and Medicine at Columbia University, as well as the Director of the Herbert Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center at New York Presbyterian Hospital. It's a pleasure to have you both on the panel today. Camille, let's start with you. We know that COVID has led to delayed screenings, diagnoses, treatment for many people. AstraZeneca obviously is one of the biggest players in the cancer drug market. Can you tell us, first of all, how the pandemic has disrupted your ability, the company's ability to get medicines to patients who need them, what the pandemic has looked like from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's a really important topic because we have seen from almost the very first months of the pandemic, we've seen that there was a disruption potentially in cancer care. First, from a diagnosis perspective, where we've seen that less patients were being diagnosed with cancer when it was not caused by the fact that there were less patients with cancer, but just by the fact that they were not diagnosed. And obviously, we know how important it is to be diagnosed as early as possible in the course of the disease when we talk about cancer. So we've really worked with all the oncology community, patient advocacy group, with medical societies, professional associations, oncologists, and various institutions to really raise awareness on the importance of going back to do screening, going back to their doctors for patients, for people who had symptoms. We heard so many stories about people having backache or something, pain, and they were just not going to see their doctors because they felt, well, that can wait a little bit longer. And potentially they didn't want to take the time of a doctor treating patients with COVID. But we know that this has impact for cancer. So we've raised awareness through a campaign called New Normal Same Cancer to bring people back to see their doctors when they had symptoms, as well as for screening and raising awareness on this important aspect. And we also know that some patients had to delay their assessment, had to delay their treatment because they were not able to go to the hospital because, again, of the pandemic. And here again, we've worked with oncologists to make sure that we raised awareness on the importance to go back and do the assessments. So really, it has been a great opportunity to collaborate and to get all together to increase the awareness on the importance of the continuum of care during this difficult time.
Okay. And Anil, can you describe, your pandemic experience? I mean, what's the biggest way that COVID-19 has, altered the work that and the research that you and your colleagues, carry out at your medical center in New York?
Being at Columbia University and New York Presbyterian Hospital in New York City, we were unfortunately at the epicenter of the pandemic in the mid to late spring of 2020. And that was truly unprecedented and historic, an inflection point, indeed, in our history. So as we were confronting the situation, there was no a book to follow. And so some of the knowledge gained, some of the skills applied were empiric. And from that, then, we could then set up protocols and algorithms. But areas that adversely affected us initially that we did overcome with our patients, families, and communities through a lot of education in our communities, especially to address healthcare disparities, was one by New York State regulation, elective surgery was postponed. But some of that elective surgery was for our patients with cancers. Secondly, procedures, especially, let's say, screening colonoscopy for average colon cancer was delayed, and therefore early detection of colon cancer and possibly other cancers through screening modalities was being compromised. Third, our ability to deliver clinical trials was severely reduced. And that's something that we worked with AstraZeneca and other pharmaceutical companies. If a clinical trial represented a so-called life or death situation, we continued, but the preponderance of clinical trials had to be deferred, be they inpatient or outpatient. So we adopted a lot of regulations and policies to deal with that help deal with all of these issues, from screening, early detection, hospitalization, clinic visits, clinical trials, education, relationships with our communities. In the second surge in the winter of 2020 into early 2021, and also somewhat of a third surge this summer and early fall, although the depth and breadth of that surge was not as dramatic as in other sectors of the country because of the high vaccination rate in the country. And frankly, because of our assiduous pursuit of vaccination and prevention measures on our campus and our hospitals, so that our infectivity rate was essentially zero.
Got it. And I wanted to, look ahead as well. Obviously, this impact, is going to be felt for years to come. What should we expect, in the fight against cancer? Are we, sadly facing an increase in deaths? Big looming costs for healthcare systems, because treatments have been delayed?
Well, there are multiple implications. The first one is indeed for patients who have not been diagnosed on time, potentially there will be an impact and we might see patients progressing quicker. However, I'm going to take maybe a little bit more of a positive look at this. I think we've learned also a lot of good things during this pandemic. We've learned how we could adjust our clinical trials. We've learned how we could simplify our ways of working. We've learned how we could collaborate better to make more impact. And we've also seen, and I think that's what we just discussed, some healthcare disparities which already existed, but really coming to light during the pandemic. And being able to understand a problem can help to reduce at least some of these disparities and tackle it. So I think there are quite a lot of good learnings that we've taken from the pandemic, from a clinical trial perspective, from an acceleration of some of the new technologies that would help us potentially address the need of more patients through telemedicine, for example, and really look at how we could address some of these barriers of healthcare disparities. One of the first steps is understand the problem, and we are now very, very, very focused on this aspect.
I mean, we've seen, COVID exacerbate those gaps in society all over the world. Anil, how is that playing out from your standpoint? I mean, when it comes to the, inequity and inequality in the healthcare realm, are you, worried about these gaps in access, widening further, due to COVID, and how are you responding to that?
Yeah. Well, I too share optimism for now and into the future that an unfortunate set of historic circumstances has led us from pessimism to optimism. That being said, I think the solutions are there. The implementation of the solutions do take time because we're trying to transform narrative and circumstances from inequity to equity. And that unfortunately cannot or does not happen overnight. It does require large-scale cooperation between public and private sectors, societal organizations, and importantly, government at the federal, state, and local level. Alignment is absolutely necessary. That being said, we at Columbia University and New York Presbyterian have invested tremendously in infrastructural support for our cancer patients. So more translators, especially to Spanish, but not exclusively so. Navigators to help our patients go from the community to our healthcare facilities and vice versa. The more care that we can deliver in our communities, home care as well as community centers, I think the better off we are in terms of implementation. Telehealth has increased dramatically, essentially non-existent in our healthcare system prior to 2020. And now almost 20% of our outpatient visits are telehealth. And that's been received extremely well, not only because of the convenience for our patients, but the ability now to speak to a patient with support systems, family members, friends that we can invite them in to help support our endeavors. Working with our community, we have over 40 partnerships with community organizations, and that's helping a lot. So increasing the infrastructural support, increasing staffing, acknowledging cultural and barriers, linguistic barriers, I think then have led us into a better pathway to address the inequity. And I think we're seeing success already, but there's still more to do.
Okay,
Yeah,
and Neil, Camille, go ahead.
James, if I can just add one thing, which I think is also another aspect, which is really important. Now that we really are getting together to tackle some of these issues around healthcare disparities, one of the focus area we have is to bring more clinical trials to diverse patients and making sure that we're more equitable from that aspect. And there are different solutions that are being built as we speak. Again, in collaboration with the different stakeholders from the institutions, oncologists, patient advocacy groups, and medical societies. And I'll just give you three very short examples of actions that we can do that can have an impact. The first step is bringing awareness on clinical trials. Not understanding what is a clinical trial is the first barrier for patients to come into a trial. So raising awareness, making this accessible to everybody in terms of understanding what is the impact of being part of a trial is extremely important. The second piece is more around unconscious bias. We know that investigators sometimes would have an unconscious bias. And so now as part of all the clinical trials that we're rolling out, we have a training for investigators. We work with all the CROs to make sure that there is a training for investigators to have a full understanding of potentially this bias. And then we know that some patients have issues with transportation to the hospital. Assuming that we are back in a context where we can go back to the hospital. And for that, there are some solutions as well where we can provide financial support for patients to come to the hospital when they live far away. And for patients who, for example, needs childcare support, we hear a lot of these stories about patients who have a family, they don't know how to come to the hospital because they have their children. So here again, we can provide some support. So having been through this pandemic helped us really to listen, to watch, to observe, to understand, to discuss with the whole oncology community to understand some of these barriers to be able to address some of them.
Great. And I wanted to, you both both brought up technology, I think, and there's been a lot of misery during the pandemic, obviously, but I think there's also been an acceleration in terms of innovation and new ways of operating. Anil, maybe from your perspective, what do you see as sort of the biggest change on the tech front, over the past 18 months that could have a big impact going forward?
Well, at our institution at Columbia University, there's been a big focus on the marriage of technology, new types of technologies with healthcare delivery. And obviously, we're seeing that across the national landscape and beyond in other countries. So one category is telehealth. It sounds simplistic with televideo, but not everyone has access, including internet access. So for X percentage, it's seamless, but for Y percentage, it's still challenging. So we have to come up with a diverse portfolio of technologies to do outreach to people who don't have access to technologies. This is where I think working directly in the communities themselves can be most helpful and can be quite attractive. The second is the ability to monitor patients' symptoms, signs, physiological values, blood test values in a longitudinal way. So that in healthcare, we tend to think of encounters as static, but really healthcare is dynamic and it's longitudinal. So the design, implementation, for instance, of wearable devices that can monitor glucose, heart rate, blood pressure, other types of physiological activities are really important from a technological viewpoint. The third is increasing ability to provide care in the homes of individuals. It's a huge burden that it's been exposed by COVID to take care of everybody that has COVID and non-COVID. People are suffering with COVID, but people without COVID are suffering too because they're not able to get into the types of acute care they need. So if we can amplify our technologies and efforts in prevention, especially in the home setting, I think that would be very attractive. So these three modalities are something that I think about a lot and that we're seeing evidence of across the landscape.
Technology front, I mean, during the pandemic, we've seen significant advances in the vaccine field, especially mRNA. What are the prospects for, cancer vaccines, from your standpoint? And, how is AstraZeneca going to maintain its position as, one of the biggest cancer drug makers, given that the whole industry has been transformed over the past couple of years?
Well, I think technology can apply to very different aspects. The first one is probably, as you're mentioning, from a research perspective, we will be probably able to identify more targets through artificial intelligence and machine learning, as we will be able probably to screen more targets and identify the one that are actionable. So I think that's going to help really to accelerate a lot of our research. Beyond this, in terms of developments, telehealth is going to help also in terms of recruitment of patients. We've seen informed consents being done electronically, which is a great opportunity potentially in some cases for patients to take more time at home and really think about if they want to be part of a trial. Plus, we've seen a lot of other aspects around assessment that can be done also more remotely. So from the research perspective, there are some great plus. From the development perspective, we see also an acceleration. And then there is all this communication that we see coming up through virtual meetings. And this is also extremely important, as we clearly see now how important is the collaboration with the communities, collaboration with all the different partners that we have in the academic world as well, and patient advocacy group. We will have the opportunity to listen more and to hear more through these different technologies. And maybe one of the last one, which I think is extremely important and will help a lot in the future, is being able to generate data from the real world setting and really assess how our medicines are being used in a practical use in the real world in a much better way with much more quality, probably through, again, some of these new technologies.
Okay, and we'll give Anil the last word since we're running out of time. But are there new, technologies or approaches that are emerging out of the pandemic that, could make a profound difference, in cancer that you would highlight in particular?
Yeah, in addition to all the issues we discussed, cancer vaccine as an approach is not new. It's actually been around for decades. Perhaps there have been barriers to advances in it. So not only are there mRNA-based vaccines, but for quite some time, there have been DNA-based vaccines. So I think in the next decade, we're going to see a revisitation or resurgence, if you will, of vaccine-based therapy, but it's not a new field.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for your time. Really enjoyed speaking with you and look forward to keeping the conversation going.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, James.
Thank you all for joining Bloomberg Prognosis, Reshaping Cancer Care. We hope you found these conversations interesting and insightful. Thanks again to all our speakers for making time for this important topic. And thank you to our sponsor, Siemens Healthineers. If you'd like more information from our sponsor, please visit the Resources tab on your screen. And most of all, thank you for being such an engaged audience. I'm Malika Kapoor on behalf of the entire team at Bloomberg Live. Thank you for watching.